Hi guys, welcome back to In Case of Econ Struggles. Welcome to another AP Micro Struggle. Today we're talking about comparative and absolute advantage and gains from trade and specialization. Here are the things the College Board wants you to know. They want you to know what absolute advantage is, comparative advantage, and how comparative advantage relates to opportunity cost, specialization and how to determine who should specialize in producing what, as well as gains from trade. So timestamps are below if you would like to jump around, but let's start talking about absolute advantage. The way you can think about absolute advantage is just who can produce the absolute most number of stuff. So for example, to make it really easy, I've got two people, Bill and Deb. Bill and Deb both knit. They make scarves and hats. Bill is really good at knitting hats. He can make 10 hats and not so good at making scarves. He can only make 5 scarves. Again, this is assuming that Bill and Deb spend all of their time knitting either scarves or hats. If Deb spends all her time knitting scarves, she's really good at scarves. She can knock out 10 scarves. She's much less good or much worse at hats, and she can only make 5 hats. So notice that because Deb can make more scarves than Bill, we would say that Deb has the absolute advantage in making scarves, but Bill can make 10 hats compared to Deb's 5, so we would say that Bill has an absolute advantage in hats. We wouldn't say that Bill has an absolute advantage or Deb has an absolute advantage overall, even if Bill could make both more scarves and more hats than Deb. When we talk about absolute or comparative advantage, we're talking about a specific good that each person or each country is producing. For comparative advantage, you should be thinking about opportunity cost and who can comparatively make more than the other person. So for example, if we think about Bill, go back to Bill's 10 hats and 5 scarves, notice that if Bill wants to knit another scarf, he's going to have to, on average, make 2 less hats, because that's how he gets from 10 to 5. But if he wants to make an extra hat, he only has to give up like half a scarf to do that. Whereas Deb's the opposite. Deb wants to make another scarf. She only needs to give up half a hat. But if she wants to make another hat, she's going to have to give up 2 scarves. So again, opportunity costs, like we talked about in the last video, what we're asking is how much of one good do you have to give up in order to make one of the other good, because we're really only talking ever about 2 goods. So just like we said, Bill has to give up 2 hats to make a scarf. So we would say that the opportunity cost to Bill of making another scarf is 2 hats. Deb, on the other hand, she only has to give up half a hat to make a scarf, so we would say that her opportunity cost of a scarf is half a hat. So notice that Deb has a lower opportunity cost of making a scarf than Bill. So Deb has the lower opportunity cost of scarves. So Deb has the comparative advantage in making scarves. And you can see if we did that the other way, we would get to the point that Bill has a comparative advantage in making hats and Deb has a comparative advantage in making scarves. So that's what we mean when we talk about comparative advantage. We're thinking about who has the lower opportunity cost of making one good in terms of the other good. Now, one thing that's confusing for a lot of people is they think that comparative and absolute advantage are the same thing. So just to briefly make sure we're on the same page, here we've got Charlie and Liz. They also knit and they make hats and scarves. But Liz is just so much better at knitting than Charlie. She can make both more hats and more scarves than Charlie. So even though that Charlie has a comparative advantage in scarves, because his opportunity cost of scarves is 1/2 compared to Liz's 2. Liz has an absolute advantage in both goods because she can just make absolutely more, both scarves and hats, than Charlie can. Now, when we're talking about trade, it's going to be really useful if Liz and Charlie can each specialize in one good so that they're not each trying to make a combination. So maybe Charlie is going to make all scarves and Liz makes all hats, and then they can just trade with each other in order to get to a point where both of them have more scarves and hats than they could if they just were working independently. And that's going to be based on comparative advantage. We're trying to maximize total output. So since Charlie has a lower opportunity cost in terms of scarves, we would say that Charlie should make scarves. Since Liz has an opportunity cost of making hats that is much less than Charlie's, we should have Liz make hats. So each person is going to only make the good in which they specialize in. By specializing, we mean the good in which they have a lower opportunity cost and so have the comparative advantage. And what this is going to do, notice that here for these PPFs for both Liz and Charlie, I'm just using a constant opportunity cost to make it easier. So notice that if Charlie makes only scarves and Liz makes only hats, Charlie's going to end up much higher than he could have if he was just alone. And Liz, she's going to be just outside of her PPF, not as much as Charlie is. This is also assuming that when they trade, they just give half of their good to the other person, which might not necessarily be the case. We'll talk about prices in a second. But this is just to illustrate for you that with trade, each person can get to a point that is higher on the PPF or their production possibility frontier than they could if they were just working independently. Now, unsurprisingly, when we're talking about trade, there's going to be prices. So what prices work in order to make this trade work? Now notice that each person has an opportunity cost for both goods. And so the price at which they trade at in terms of hats and scarves should be somewhere between their opportunity cost, because if it's not, then it's not going to work. Then one person is going to be paying more than what that scarf or hat is worth to them. So you can see that it's got to be between 1/2 and 2. So for example, when we talked about that trade, we did a 1-for-1 trade, which works just fine because 1 is going to be between each person's 1/2 and 2. They will be able to trade and they will both be happy about that. So hopefully this just gives you a better idea about trade in terms of comparative advantage, absolute advantage, and opportunity cost. If this was helpful, make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time for another case of econ struggles.